my soldiers. I cut the grass, expose the cobras. Yeah, watch me shine through tinted rovers. Then shut the game down like changing over.
Hello and welcome to Red Talks. I am Jen Lotito, the president and COO of Red. I'm thrilled to be here to talk about the battle against HIV and the progress, the remarkable progress that we've seen. One of the reasons why we've seen this progress in the fight is the contribution of the life science companies. We at Red are lucky to work with a number of those companies, including Merck, Roche, IQVIA, and as well as ViiV Healthcare, who is the sponsor of today's Red Talk. So as we'll talk about today, we recognize that AIDS is still a crisis, HIV is still a crisis, despite the fact that it may not be in the headlines anymore. We recognize the need for partnership as a way to end that crisis. We know how to do it. We have the tools. We just need the partnership in order to get there. And I'm really excited, speaking of partnership, to have Deborah Waterhouse here with us today, the CEO of ViiV Healthcare, president of GSK Global Health, and someone who knows a lot about partnership and is going to be talking about that here today. So Deborah, welcome to Red Talks.
Thank you very much. Great to be here and to be partnering with Red again.
Wonderful. So let's start a little bit about how AIDS shaped your career, Deborah. I recognize you and I are around the same age. When we think back to the college days that we had, and the thought of HIV and AIDS was absolutely terrifying. If I think back to around those days, if you were diagnosed with HIV, you had roughly an 18-month life expectancy. So essentially, you were diagnosed it and you had about 18 months before you were going to die. That has changed drastically thanks to the work of you and your company. But I'm just wondering what impact that had on your career, and also what's changed in the AIDS fight, and maybe what hasn't changed. So let's start with what impact did that have in shaping your career?
So when I was at college, you're right. I mean, we used to see these terrible adverts with tombstones on them, which just scared the life out of everybody. But I think also added to stigma, and we'll come back to the importance of that, which is still with us today. Science, luckily, has enabled people living with HIV to go from a life expectancy of around 18 months to now, if you take your medication, to have the same life expectancy as people that are not living with HIV. So science has delivered a huge change in the morbidity and mortality experienced by those living with HIV. And so when I joined GSK, which was the company that I started my career in the pharmaceutical industry with, I joined a company that had discovered the first medicine to treat HIV, and that was AZT. And GSK, and now ViiV, is still in the fight against HIV. But I also remember the bad old days where people would be standing outside the building at GSK in countries around the world protesting about lack of access to medicines. And I remember thinking, well, we have to change that because science is incredible. It will change the trajectory of this disease. I was absolutely convinced. But it had to be on the terms of a global tackling of the epidemic and not just allowing medicines to be available to countries where they could afford to buy them. And so that for me was a very important part of my belief system around how we end the HIV epidemic. And science has done an incredible turnaround whereby today, if you're living with HIV and you take your medication, you've got the life expectancy of somebody that's not living with HIV, but stigma is still there. And nothing has changed between 1988 and today. Some progress has been made, but not a lot. And so for me, it's not just about the science and the medicine to keep the virus suppressed or to prevent the acquisition of HIV. It's fighting stigma every single day, because those tombstones were completely unrepresentative of how we should see this virus and those who are living with HIV. And yeah, we've not come far enough on that journey, but that is something that I work towards every day.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And when you think about it, so much has changed, to your point, but so much has stayed the same. So could you talk a little bit about what you feel like has truly changed in the fight and what has unfortunately not changed?
Well, the things that have changed, I mean, first of all, let's start with the science. So, today, if you're living with HIV, you can take a single tablet every day and suppress your virus, and your life expectancy is the same as someone not living with HIV. So let's go to the side effects. At the beginning of the epidemic, whilst you could treat HIV, the side effects were extremely challenging for people to live with. Today, that once daily tablet has very limited side effects. And in fact, again, people just live their best lives whilst taking their treatment. So I think science has made a massive difference to what it's like to live with HIV. However, let's talk a little bit about stigma. I spend a lot of time with the HIV community around the world, in the US, in Europe, Australia, Canada, Japan, and sub-Saharan Africa. And stigma is absolutely alive and kicking. And we have a lot of programs that we work with the community on, which is about tackling stigma. An example would be something in the UK we're doing at the moment with Gareth Thomas, who's the former captain of Welsh rugby team and a member of the British Lions squad. And we have a crazy thing, a double-decker bus, and we go to sporting events with Gareth and we talk to communities that probably are not connected to or understanding HIV and what it's like to live with HIV. And we tackle head-on stigma, and we educate and we talk, and we bring to communities across the UK and soon into Europe around the World Cup, the Rugby World Cup in France. That tackling idea of HIV stigma. And we have many, many programs globally where we do that head on, because that is something that we have to continue to fight against. People with HIV should be treated with respect and like anybody else, in the world today. So, and they're not. So that's unjust and needs to be, addressed head on.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't seem like we're ever going to end this thing if we don't really tackle, no pun intended, tackle the stigma issue head on. And we see it as well. We see it here in the States. We certainly see it in sub-Saharan Africa. The programs that we're funding are very much focused on the stigma, because if you can't get past that stigma, none of the other progress that you talked about matters. So that's really, really great. So we started with a little bit of your career. I wanted to ask you a little bit more on your career, just because as a female CEO, I love tapping into the knowledge. I have a college-age daughter. I think about her going off and what she's going to be doing next in her life. But you've worked at GSK since the mid-90s, and I've heard you've done everything from sales, marketing, R&D, and even HR. So I'm very impressed with your resume, in addition to all of the knowledge that you have around this fight. But can you talk about how that experience has really shaped your career as well as your leadership style?
Yeah, so when I started early on in my career, I wanted to make sure that I had the right foundation from a knowledge and experience perspective to have a long and successful career. So I very deliberately spent time, if you like, learning my craft. So I spent time in the sales force, time in marketing, government affairs, as you say, R&D, and I did a rotation through HR, which was fantastic, because if you don't understand the people part of any business, then you will never unlock its true potential. And then I went on to live in Australia and New Zealand and run our business there. I ran our business in Central and Eastern Europe. And then I spent a number of years in the United States. And again, I ran our vaccines business and primary care business, did all different things in the US before taking over the CEO role of ViiV Healthcare. However, I did have a very profound experience in the late 90s and early 2000s, because that was when I'd worked in many different areas, and I was given the opportunity to lead the European HIV business and become very much more connected to this very, very important therapy area. And that's where my passion actually began for HIV, and everything I was kind of working towards as my career progressed was actually the job I've got today, which for me is an absolute dream, given my passion for this therapy area and the incredible, I guess, purpose that we have, which is to leave no person living with HIV behind. So I couldn't ask for a better job. I mean, in terms of the things that I've learned during my career, I think the first thing I really benefited from was living in lots of different countries, seeing the world through a different window and experiencing true immersion in different cultures. I think once you live outside your own country and you do it multiple times, you begin to see what the world is made of, which is people who all want the same thing. They want to be healthy, they want to be happy, they want to have people around them that they love, they want to have friends. If they choose to have children, they want those children to grow up and to thrive. And so the otherness, the differences, which today's populist world sometimes drives us to believe, these wedges between each country and each type of person, they just melt away when you live everywhere and anywhere, because you realize that we are so similar in what we want, more so than the differences that we may have from a political or religious or other areas. So that was the first piece. And then the second piece was around the value of diversity. So if you're going to run a really successful company, you need to have this incredible purpose, but you need to have a diverse group of people to work with, both within your own company, so a diverse and inclusive culture, because that's when you truly perform at your best, because you've got ideas from everybody challenges, everybody is there to represent the community in the world in which you live. And I think that's, very, very powerful. And of course, then the community and the partners that we have add more diversity. So that for me has been a massive learning. And I would never run a team that was not the most diverse and most challenging team. And I would not want to work in a company where you couldn't truly be yourself every single day, your true self, not your business self, as it were, which I think is how many people feel. So those are my learnings, and that's my career path.
It's amazing. And I think both of the things that you said about getting out there and also the incredible importance of diversity and differences of life experiences, that is truly what's at the core of the future in terms of solving the world's biggest problems. So I couldn't agree with you more. But on the first point you made about getting out there and traveling, I have to say, I'm a huge fan of mentorship. And I think about what is the advice that I give to young girls, especially young girls. Obviously, mentoring can be anybody, but I prefer to talk to young girls because I feel like I can relate to them. I've been there before and understanding what's next in your career. And I think especially that point you made about traveling, getting out there, and the point you made about the similarities we all have versus the differences, it's not until you get out there and you travel the world, you get comfortable, not only in your own skin, but with those that are around you. Because like you said, we all want the same thing. And it's funny, I was just having this conversation about going to study abroad when you're in college. That's where it starts, I think. We've raised our kids to travel the world, but I think when you go off and you do it in college, that's when I think that's where it becomes a real game changer. So, when you think about mentorship, when you think about young girls and women looking to climb the corporate ladder, what is the advice that you typically give to them?
So the first thing I always say is, be you. Don't imagine that you have to conform to some stereotypical view of what you think a business person looks like. Each of us bring our own special gifts, our own diverse flavors of who we are, what we've experienced. And so you should every day turn up as your true, authentic self. Because I think if you start your career believing that you need to conform, that you need to look a certain way, behave in a certain way, you'll lose yourself and it will just sap your energy, because it's exhausting trying to be somebody that you're not. So that's my kind of first advice. And my second advice,
let me just say on that one, it's important to know yourself, right? And I think all of us have to really think about who is that self that we're bringing, right? So I think it's important to recognize that, but then present it as you're walking around and carrying it with you, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I completely agree with that. And then the second thing I always say is be curious. So you may enter a company or any kind of an organization through one door, and that door can say marketing or science or sales, whatever it is. Keep a very open mind, ask questions, and be curious, because that curiosity is the thing that actually marks each individual out as having room to grow, having the most potential, and it will allow you to thrive and progress, not necessarily kind of up a hierarchy, because that's not what everybody wants to do, but progress in terms of learning who you are and what you want to achieve. Curiosity is a really, really important attribute. And so don't be categorical in your thinking. Don't think in black and white terms. Think in what questions shall I ask? What do I want to know? And how can I best develop myself? And I think if you can truly know who you are and be your true self, if you can be curious and a lifelong learner and always looking to ask why, then I think that is my advice, because that will set you on the road to not just a successful career, but one that makes you happy.
Well, I think, Deborah, you and I are cut from the same cloth, because I actually just wrote an article on this about what it's like to be an intern, or how to get the best intern experience, right? And so I think being curious, getting in there, asking questions, don't be afraid. I am someone who has always asked questions. I encourage everybody to ask questions, because that not only helps you learn, but it also, engages you in the conversation. It shows you care. And I think when you go out and ask those questions, like to your point, you just become more well-rounded and you see what's out there. And that's the way you're going to progress in the world. You're not going to just, who wants to just stay in their spot? Like you were talking about, you've got a job that you absolutely loved because you went and you tried different things. You probably asked a lot of questions. All of that goes into, I think, bringing yourself to the career that you want, is really understanding what's going on around you, asking everybody what's happening around me, and maybe actually, as you saw with all of the different groups that you've worked in, seeing, I might be sitting in this group right now, but that one looks really interesting. You won't know until you go and ask the questions. So we're definitely cut from the same cloth. So that's really, really helpful. So now I want to switch gears and really focus on ViiV. ViiV is a truly unique model, 100% dedicated to HIV/AIDS. And I'm curious about the origins of the ViiV model and what prompted GSK and Pfizer to establish an AIDS-focused business.
So ViiV Healthcare is about 12 years old. It was formed by Pfizer and GSK. And after a short while, a company called Shinogi joined as a shareholder. And we wanted to create a company that was 100% focused on an area of incredible global unmet medical need, and that was HIV. And our mission is to leave no person living with HIV behind. And that is a mission that's easy to say, but difficult to live. And why I say that is because once you've set that as your mission, you have to commit yourself to running the company so that it meets the aspiration that you've spoken out loud to the world. And I believe we are a special company because we do that. So let me describe how we run our business. So in high income and upper middle income countries, we strike deals with governments and payers in the US, and we agree a price for our medicines, and then they're delivered through the healthcare systems of those countries. It's Europe, the US, Australia, Japan, all of those types of kind of wealthier countries. In middle-income countries, we strike high volume but low per unit value tenders. Brazil is a great example, where we supply about 6 million packs of our medicines a year to Brazil at an affordable price, which means they can use our medications with the people who are living with HIV in Brazil, and we do similar types of contracts in other countries. And that's probably about 1 million people, 1.5 million people who are living with HIV. But actually, the main burden of the disease sits in lower and low middle income countries, mainly sub-Saharan Africa. And so what we do is we work with the medicine patent pool, and we issue royalty-free voluntary licenses so that generic manufacturers can manufacture at high volumes and low prices our medicines, so that access is there for those countries that experience the HIV burden most significantly. So at the moment, it costs about $75 a year per person for HIV treatment in most of sub-Saharan Africa. There's 16 generic manufacturers that we've given a license to, and they produce high volumes of dolutegravir, which is our main medicine, and 21 million people who are living with HIV are on a dolutegravir-based regimen. And that's what we do for adults. Actually, children, it's very difficult to treat children who are living with HIV. 99.9% of them live in the low and low middle income countries. And so we've specifically developed pediatric friendly formulations. They're called dispersible tablets. So really they're tablets that dissolve in water. They're flavored so that children of the youngest age can take them. And then we've worked in partnership with generic manufacturers to again make sure that they can manufacture high volume, low price versions of these medications so that children living with HIV have a formulation that they can take. And currently about half of the world's children who are taking an HIV medicine are on a dolutegravir based regimen. So if you're in Kinshasa, Cape Town, Nairobi, London, New York, as you are today, Los Angeles, Oslo, you have access to a dolutegravir based regimen. And that's why 80% of people living with HIV on the planet who are taking medicine are taking one of ours, which is quite an incredible feat, but that is how we live our mission.
And it's amazing. It really is an incredible feat. As we started the conversation talking about the 18-month life expectancy if you were diagnosed with HIV, and now you look at it, I mean, for so much of the work we've been doing at Red, and I've seen this, there are people, you guys have been able to lower the cost of it so that the Global Fund, which is the recipient of all Red money, when they're going and distributing that treatment, the recipients who are accessing the treatment don't have to choose between paying the rent and being healthy. So thanks to those incredible partnership models that you guys have developed, that has really changed the game. And I know going back to the beginnings of Red and the Global Fund, if that model didn't exist, I don't think we'd be anywhere near where we are in the fight. So I wanted, actually, that tees up my next question, which is around partnership. We talked about this in the beginning. You just mentioned partnership. We recognize here at Red that HIV AIDS is really just a massive, massive fight, and it's not going to be solved by any one entity. It's not going to be solved by a government. It's not going to be solved by a country. And it's certainly not going to be solved by one company. We really need life-saving partnerships that are going to drive testing, that are going to drive treatment, and that will drive care. We know that is the way we are going to end this crisis. We know how to do it. All of it's there. We know how to do it, but we need the partnerships in order to do it, and do it soon. So can you talk a little bit about what does partnership mean to you, and what is ViiV Healthcare? How are you advancing that value of partnership?
So there's no way we will ever end the epidemic without all of us working together in partnership. We are all small cogs in a big machine, and if we all turn together at the right moment, we can create incredible energy, and we can end this epidemic. And so if I think about the partnerships that we have partnerships with community. So the voice of the community helps us actually get the insight to know how and what to do from an R&D perspective in terms of developing medicines, but it also tells us that through our positive action program, which is the area of ViiV where we give grants to community-based groups and projects to enable them locally to set up testing programs to ensure that treatment happens even in the most far-flung parts of sub-Saharan Africa, that stigma is fought. All of that activity happens through grants that we give through positive action. And then how do you, when you've got a product in your hands that can make a difference to the epidemic, how do you make sure it has a whole global impact? And that is where Red and the work that you do to give money along with other governments and funders into the Global Fund. So we work with the Global Fund, we work with NGOs, we work with PEPFAR, we work with UNAIDS, we work with the WHO. It is a huge village that will end this epidemic together, and each one of us has a role to play. And each one of us needs to be very, very deliberate and focused on continuing to nurture and strengthen and expand those partnerships. And that's how we've managed, for example, to get dolutegravir to 22 million people globally, how we are treating half of the world's children who are on an antiretroviral with a dolutegravir-based regimen, and how today we're currently setting up a model where our prevention, cabotegravir, which is to prevent the acquisition of HIV, how that medicine is again going to be made available, not just in the countries where people can afford to buy it, but actually those countries where the burden of disease sits. And so as I pick my way through that very, very complicated opportunity and challenge, every step of the way, we have to have a partner by our side, either providing money, people, infrastructure, and an absolute focus on the job in hand, which is to end the epidemic. So partnership is crucial. We are nothing without those that stand beside us, but when we stand together, we can absolutely change the trajectory of this terrible, ravaging epidemic.
Absolutely. And I think, as we know, it's one thing to have the drugs. It's another thing to get those drugs into the places where it's needed. Yeah. And I have seen on the ground, as you mentioned, all of those partnerships coming together as a community, everybody working. I mean, there's so many communities that are being targeted, marginalized communities that maybe people are not always talking about, but those are the areas that we must get into and make sure they have access to the drugs that are needed. Because if we don't do that, like you said, we are never going to be able to end this epidemic. So speaking of ending the epidemic, I want to end this session on a positive note. So can you talk a little bit about what's giving you hope, what's giving you encouragement in the AIDS fight right now?
Oh, I have so much hope. So let me tell you
why.
so
happy to hear that.
I have so much hope. So I have the hope of science and I have the hope of partnership. So first of all, I believe that we have a unique opportunity when we come together to tackle this epidemic as a multiplicity of powerful partners. We set the stage for the end of this epidemic. So what can we do? Why am I so optimistic? Well, in the heart of what I do, it's about research and development of medicines. And so when I think about how science is progressing, that's why I get very excited. So people, they wish to take medication, can take 1 tablet a day, or they now have the opportunity of taking long-acting injectables, so they don't have to worry as much about adherence, but they can suppress their virus in that way. I know that in our pipeline and the pipeline of others who are in this field, we're aiming to have a longer and longer gap between the administration of those long-acting injectables. So you could be down to as little as 2 injections a year, and then your HIV is suppressed for every single day of that year. Why is that important? Because it helps tackle stigma. People don't have to have medication in their house, helps adherence because people don't forget the doses and therefore become resistant to the virus, doesn't become resistant to the medicines. And then last but by no means least, it helps people live in a way that is free of the self-stigma that people experience when they're living with this disease. So imagine that, from 365 tablets a year to just 2 shots, and you're virally suppressed and free to live your life. The other area I'm super excited about is the area of prevention. Again, science is moving forward. So actually, you could also be in a situation where you could protect yourself from acquiring HIV, 2 shots a year. Imagine if you're that adolescent girl or young woman in sub-Saharan Africa who has little or no power over what happens in her life, lives in an environment where gender-based violence or the requirement potentially to trade what she has, which is often her body, for payment or other benefits. She doesn't have the opportunity or the power to say, well, I want you to wear a condom, actually, or I need to do something to protect myself. 2 shots a year, and she is protected and empowered and will remain HIV free. And whilst her life today is difficult, as we look to the future, her life will be easier if she's not living with HIV. And so it's that makes me excited. And then ultimately, I know the science that is leading us towards a cure. I'm not sure there'll be a vaccine in the short term, but certainly a cure which could lead to, HIV epidemic really coming to an end, and that could be an end to something that has plagued us for 40 years. And so I am so optimistic, but it can only happen through partnership, not just through science. And so those would be the two things that make me extremely optimistic about the future.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And as we close this episode of Red Talks, I want to acknowledge the extraordinary progress that we've made in this fight. But I also want to acknowledge the partnerships that are key to saving lives. At Red, we're doing our part by partnering with the world's biggest companies to ensure we're providing testing, treatment, and care where it's needed most. And speaking of partners, thank you to ViiV Healthcare for sponsoring today's episode. And huge thanks to Deborah Waterhouse for joining us today. Stay tuned to this channel for our next episode of Red Talks, and don't forget to follow Red on social media and join the fight. Thanks so much, and have a great day.